Welcome back to Lecture 17. We now turn to Paradise Lost, Book 3, and the second invocation, what some scholars have called the restart button. But of course, we're going to see that these two invocations, the one from Paradise Lost, Book 1, and obviously the one from Book 3, are going to have some similarities and obviously some differences. Because I love the poetry of Milton, let's just do that to start with. And let's just work through the first 50 or 55 lines of the poem together. Read along with me. I'll pause and make observations as we go. Milton, the blind poet bard, in the tradition of Homer, in the tradition of Tiresias, will begin now Book 3. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn, or of the eternal co-eternal being, may I express thee unblamed? Since God is light, and never but in unapproached light dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in the bright affluence of bright essence incarnate. Exclamation point. Let's just pause for a moment and put it in our notes. Notice the constant referencing to light, to brightness. The expectation, of course, in Book 3 is we're going to see God. How do you describe God? Well, we played the same game when we were with Dante, of course, in his Divine Comedy, as Dante the pilgrim finds his way out of purgatory and then, of course, into Paradiso. And then, what is it? It's just unbelievably bright. So bright that sometimes it's dark. That kind of thing. We'll continue. Or, hearest thou rather pure ethereal stream, whose fountain who shall tell? Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert, and at the voice of God, as with a mantle, didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep, one from the void and formless infinite. Again, notice the exclamation points. Now, already we're setting ourselves up for this worship poem. I call it a worship poem simply because Milton is clearly engaged in writing a song that's like a song of worship. And we'll come back to it, but already we're getting that sense of, let's put it in our notes, this is going to be language of celebration, language of deification, language of tribute to the supreme deity. Thee I revisit now, with bolder wing, escaped the Stygian pool, though long detained in that obscure sojourn, while in my flight through utter and through middle darkness borne, with other notes than to the Orphean lie, I sung of chaos and eternal night, taught by the heavenly muse to venture down the dark descent and up to reascend, though hard and rare. We heard, of course, this idea about getting out of hell is hard work. The poet, Milton, will say, I've spent 2 books in hell, and that's been hard work for me. Now I'm ready to come out of that, and I'm ready to come out of the darkness and go to the light of heaven, in other words, right? Notice he says it's an obscure sojourn, an odyssey. Let's put it in our notes. Milton clearly understands that what he's doing, what he's inventing, what he's authoring, that's going to be an important idea in Book 3, is significant. It's important. But at the same time, as we've already said, Milton realizes he's treading on some very sacred ground here, no pun intended. We'll keep going. Thee I revisit safe, a key, of course, in understanding. In other words, now I'm in heaven, I'm safe, I can talk about something I feel more comfortable talking about. And feel thy sovereign vital lamp. Again, we're back to lamps and lighting. But thou revisitest not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray and find no dawn. Milton is blind. It's a powerful image. It's like he's looking for the light, literally, and of course metaphorically. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled. Can't see anything. Yet not the more seaside to wander where the muses haunt, clear spring or shady grove or sunny hills, smit with the love of sacred song. Milton loves music. Of course, remember, his father was a musician, an amateur musician, but fairly acclaimed. He loves the sacred song, and we're going to get the sacred song actually in book 3. But chief thee, Sion, and the flowery brooks beneath that wash thy hallowed feet in warbling flow, nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other two equaled with me in fate. So were I equaled with them in renown. He hopes that he can be famous. Blind Thamyris and blind Minonenes and Tiresias and Phineas, prophets old, he identifies them with the ancient classic tradition that some of the greatest bards and prophets are blind. Then feed on thoughts that voluntarily move harmonious numbers as the wakeful bird sings darkling, and in shadiest covert hid tunes her nocturnal note. Thus with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of venial bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human face divine, all the things he can no longer see. And it's of course sad, right, that Milton is saying this. I mean, he can't even see the faces of the ones he loves, like maybe his daughters, for example, who are recording as amanuensis these lines. But cloud instead, and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair presented with a universal blank of nature's works, to me expunged and erased, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. In other words, think about it. He's going to write a poem about the quest for knowledge, but he himself will have to live off of, feed off of, the reading that he did for all those years in school and then outside of school for that famous 6 years of reading. He says, that's all I got to go on because I can't anymore see the beautiful things of nature. We think immediately of Milton, a contemporary. We think as well of Newton. We'll get to him later in his famous studies as well in science. We think of Galileo's quest to see the sun and the stars. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, and the mind, through all her powers, irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. I can't help but think at level 3A of that passage from Whitman's Song of Myself, passage 46. Now I wash the gum from your eyes. You must habit yourself to the dazzle of the light. Whitman obviously knew these lines, and Whitman himself, as poet bard of the great American tradition, is playing a very similar game in Leaves of Grass. Of course, let's just say it, there's beauty here. All of the things he knows he now misses as he's blind. It's pathetic in the Aristotelian sense of that word, that we identify with a protagonist in Milton who is now blind. Of course, we think, don't we, when we think of Aristotle, we think of that poetics, and we think, yes, of course, of Oedipus Rex, and how Oedipus is at the end blind, at the moment he knows he's blinded, of course. So we start in heaven, and we are ready now to begin the process of what it is that God sees. Now the Almighty from above, from the pure Empyrean where he sits, high enthroned. And we immediately think, of course, of that beginning of book 2 of Paradise Lost, where Satan was sitting on his throne. Now we have God sitting on his throne. And he sees certain things. Line 69, as he watches, he sees, for example, Adam and Eve in their blissful solitude. He sees Satan, of course, at line 73, on his wearied wings. Satan has been flying, of course, through space to get to earth. He's coming to earth. God sees this as well. Let's point out that at line 78, we see it, that God sees everything, past, present, future. He beholds everything. And he turns now to his son and is ready to speak. I'm at lines 78, 79 ED. The God's speech begins at line 80 and goes now through lines 134. Because of the importance of these lines, I think it makes sense for us to read them together. Practicing, obviously, the reading is important, but here there is so much more going on. Let's go ahead and set it up. Let me give you a schemata. We said that we are reading this epic, not just this poem, not just as an epic, but as a philosophic, theological treatise in many ways. Milton has an agenda, and he said it from the beginning. I want to justify the ways of God to men. I want to explain why God has done what God has done. Now, we've already pointed out earlier that this is potentially a disturbing kind of paradigm. God needs Milton to explain to us why God does what God does. Well, this can be somewhat problematic, but we'll go ahead and forgive Milton on this count. But when God speaks, we're going to point out right away, there's a different tone than when Satan speaks. God, for Milton, is a struggle to represent, as one would expect. What God? Will this be a personal deity? Our line, in great, will be our one prism into that. Or will this rather be a transpersonal deity? We'll come back to this notion, but you can read the opening lines of this part, Book 3, with, instead of hail, holy light, we might say today, hail, holy energy. Light, energy, is not something personal, but rather, we've been using the term transpersonal, beyond the personal. Of course, this now will be the speech where Milton will present his theodicy, the idea that one must explain why there is pain and suffering and evil, bad stuff. You'll remember our triangle from an earlier lecture. On one corner, the bad stuff. On another corner, the idea of an all-powerful deity. And then on the other corner, an idea of an all-loving deity. How do you explain the fact that a child lies in a hospital room dying of leukemia when there is an all-powerful, all-loving deity? These don't seem to fit. And Milton will say, they do fit, and here's why. Now, the way Milton decides to do this is through a speech by God, where God will then speak to his Son, only begotten Son. And we immediately think, of course, of that John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. We'll get to the ideas of redemption in a moment. Let's go ahead now and just listen to the majesty of Milton's poetics. But let's point out that God speaks kind of like the way the laws of physics might speak. Redundant sometimes, no similes of any kind, no figurative language, simply oracular, declared. Let's read it and enjoy. Only begotten Son, seest thou what rage transports our adversary? He sees Satan traveling towards the world, whom no bounds prescribed, no bars of hell, nor all the chains heaped on him there, nor yet the main abyss wide interrupt, can hold. In other words, Satan can't be held. We'll meet our first question of many that we're writing down. Obviously, one of the questions is, can God not stop Satan? Or he won't stop Satan? And what's up with that? If you know Satan is about to come to Eden and to jack all of humankind, why not stop him? We'll keep reading. So bent he, Satan, seems on desperate revenge. The idea is that he knows Satan is trying to get revenge for having been thrown out of heaven. That, he says, this whole project of Satan's shall redound upon his own rebellious head. Let's just pause and put it in our notes. God says he's not going to be able to get away with it. Of course, we kind of know how this story unfolds by Paradise Lost Book 9, because we've read, of course, our Genesis 3 account already. We know, of course, what happens. That, in fact, at least it's perceived as if Satan has won. This notion of whether Satan has in fact won or not will be central to Milton's theodicy. But now, To continue. Through all restraint broke loose. All restraint? In other words, God did everything God could do to restrain Satan. He, Satan, wings his way not far off heaven in the precincts of light directly towards the new created world and man there placed, with purpose to essay if him by force he can destroy, or worse, by some false guile pervert, and shall pervert. For man will hearken to his glozing lies. Notice the beautiful word glozing. It has a sound almost like a snake, right? Glozing lies. And easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. We're back to the opening lines. Disobedience of Book 1 of Paradise Lost. So will fall. Now we pointed out, of course, that the word fall nor the word sin appears in the Genesis 3 account. And yet, Milton, like most Christian theologians, including St. Augustine, will see that as a fall, that what happens in Genesis 3. And here it is. He says it. God says it. Man's going to be beguiled by Satan and will fall. He and his faithless progeny, in other words, the men to follow, men and women to follow. And now the question at line 96. The question that, of course, many readers of this poem already are asking. Whose fault? In other words, whose fault is it? This is the theodicy question. Whose fault is it that there is evil, pain, suffering, sin in the world? By the way, you don't have to be a believer in Christian theology to ask this question. Why is it that terrible things happen to quote-unquote good people? This is a question that we're always dealing with. And by extension, of course, we seem to want to have some sense of meaning in the universe, some sense of purpose. Whose fault? The next line, line 97. Whose but his own? In other words, humans can only blame humans for the fall. This will be the first step in the theodicy project. But then we have an interesting, many scholars have read it as a pivot almost, or a switch, a moving, with the word ingrate. An individual not feeling gratitude, ingrate, ungrateful. Ingrate. He had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. You can hear the repetition of this language. By the way, some scholars have pointed out that this word ingrate may be Milton's attempt to have God speak specifically about Satan. How could Satan do that? He was an equal angel with all the other angels in heaven, and yet ingrate. Others, of course, have pointed out that it's easier to read this as well as God's first observation about how could Adam have eaten from the forbidden fruit, and of course Eve as well. Notice here, the idea then is that human beings were created with the power and the right to choose. We'll continue. This, of course, is central to the reason we're working so slowly through this is I want you to understand Milton's theodicy. And of course, it will be the theodicy of any number of Christian theologians and Christian believers going forward. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, nor what they would? What praise could they receive, what pleasure I, from such obedience paid, when will and reason also is choice, useless and vain of freedom, both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity? Not me. Let's pause. The argument, the theodictic argument of Milton is simply this. Humans had to be created with free will, choice, agency sometimes called, or their worship of God, their praise of God could not be legitimate in God's eyes. Now, obviously, a question which has to be addressed here and raised here, we'll address it as we move on, is the simple question, why would a perfect being, God, all-powerful, all-knowing, need to create? This is, of course, not a new question. It's a question Milton understood intuitively. As he says it, he says that one of the reasons that God created was for pleasure. Line 107 of this reading. He'll later say glory at line 164. Eternal purpose at line 172. But it does beg the question, why would a perfect being create in the first place? By extension, obviously, create a world that is fallen. But let's point out, Milton doesn't say he created a world fallen. God created a world that was perfect. But he had to give humans the right to choose to fall. And if they chose to fall, he says it. I can't be held responsible. It's not my fault. Now, of course, at 3b later, we're going to ask if this theodicy answer works for you or not. Before we argue against it, let's make sure we understand it. Back to the text. They, therefore, as to right belong, so were created, nor can justly accuse their maker. We immediately think, of course, of this lecture, of the lecture that I gave earlier on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the idea that who do you blame for all the terrible things Frankenstein's monster does do? I mean, who do you blame for all those terrible things? Do you blame the monster or do you blame the creator? We are here with Milton saying, you cannot blame the creator. That's against the rules. That's totally against the rules, right? So it's one of those kind of dynamics where we say, no, we can't blame the creator. We have to blame individually man. Notice, not me. They therefore as to right belong so